Draconic Gamer here, back with another video. Sorry I haven't posted a video in quite some time. I've been trying to get some things situated. I'm also thinking about introducing you to a certain character that I think you guys are gonna love. So, anyway, if you are at all new here, hit that like button down below and smash that subscribe button and hit that little bell icon down below to become a part of the Dragon Squad. Okay, let's get into today's video.
And it's a natural thing, of course. I mean, I could work out all day, and obviously I'm an ex-athlete myself.
See that wire? Stay underneath it, okay? Just keep your head low and you'll be fine.
All right.
An exotic new snack.
How are you?
All right, thank
Are you peckish?
No, I'm Turkish.
You're a cute one. Do you like squeaky toys?
It's in you. How can you be running? How can you be running? It's in you. It's in you.
Just doing some review for my test. Just remember, one way to read faster is to read faster.
Back at it again at Krispy Kreme.
Hold on, something's coming out of here. Look, there's a bird, dude. It knows what's good. I'm telling you, I just heard it inside.
He's got the wrist flip though, so.
Oh, more Rubicund. Daria?
What is rotunderer?
No.
I think you're gonna like this.
Let's go!
Don't push this button. Because that will set off the bomb immediately and we'll all be dead. Now repeat back what I just said.
See, this is what's wrong with your generation. It's a beautiful day outside, and you're sat in front of the TV.
It's a cat. It's not supposed to be outside.
Hell yeah! I have the power of God!
With this camera, I shoot pictures of people who don't drink Wilkins coffee. I'm ready. Shoot. Anybody else?
I told you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't. I'm sorry. It's always the screaming goat that gets me. Let me just go back to that.
I told you. You die for that.
definitely not thinking of those sausage links for breakfast and the same ever again.
It's free real estate.
That dead gonna fall over. And it was gonna happen, but still.
Okay. I love you, Mr. Bubs. Do you love me too? No? Oh, no. I think he loves me.
Yeah, I got you. I got this on camera.
She's a wolf in mouse clothing. The mouse's ghostly howl stakes claim to...
Not allowed on the beaches or in the parks outside certain hours. So how is it that these two are roaming their neighbourhood, frightening the locals, and the council isn't stopping it?
Now, yesterday morning, I came out into the front yard and the dogs were across the road. And as soon as they saw me, they came bounding over. And I just made it into the front door in time.
Ray Graham is a
These creatures were here before us. And if we're not careful, they're gonna be here after. Welcome to Jurassic World.
From the makers of one of the most successful dramas in recent history comes the follow-up series, The Slap, Part 2.
You know what? They'd already started repairs, so we couldn't even take it anywhere else. 2.5 grand later, and then... Hey, what's going on?
It's mine, Daddy. Noah keeps taking away from me.
Noah, give it back.
No.
Noah, give it back.
No!
I said give it back now. Noah!
Larry, what the hell are you doing?
Larry! Larry, you can't just... Oh,
Larry! Oh, are you all right? How did...
Larry!
Righto, what's going on here?
Oh, sir, I'm arrested. Oh!
The Slap, Part 2, coming soon to Fox. Ow! What the? Slap, Part 2, coming soon to Fox. Ow! What the?
When I finally got down here to the house to look see what happened, the door was standing wide open. It looked like he was packing up for a yard sale. He was lying, throwing his hands, and he did pull a gun on me when I got back around the house because I guess he thought I was upset with him. Who steals a cheese grater? He's got the works, Lysol. He stole an empty bottle of spray. What got me the most was my soap. He stole my soap. Who steals soap?
CBS 2's Serene Branson is live at the Staples Center with highlights and backstage coverage we're seeing for the very first time. Serene.
Well, a very, very heavy debatation tonight. We had a very daring fight. Let's go to Terrace and look for the head of the pit.
And the Grammy goes.
Ooh, Lord, my poops are too big.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome to Smarter Every Day. Have you ever just sat down and taken a really close look at nuts? I've been doing that for the last few minutes.
Most of this stuff isn't really that funny. Most of this stuff I've seen before, too.
I love refrigerators.
Seriously, that again? Okay. I'll watch that later. Let's watch this. Satisfying Times Karma came back.
There's nothing more satisfying than a heaping slice of justice. It's even better when it occurs naturally, carried out in accordance with the universe's twisted sense of humor. Karma has been dealing out justice since the dawn of time, but only recently have technological advancements allowed us to capture its wickedly wonderful ways on video. Satisfaction of seeing infuriatingly inconsiderate people receive some instant justice in super convenient video form. In this viral clip, a woman clearly thinks her conversation with a friend is more important than allowing the train to leave the station on time. Train delays are annoying enough, let alone when they're caused by selfish individuals. With a swift kick, the situation was resolved, much to the surprised pleasure of the other passengers. Time to rewind. This timeless tale, passed down through the generations, begins at the end of the 19th century. When Texan Henry Zeiglin broke his fiance's heart by calling off their engagement, she was so distraught that she committed suicide. Her brother, overcome by vengeance-fueled fury, made his way onto Henry's land and shot him before using the second round in the chamber on himself. Little did he know the first bullet had merely grazed the side of Henry's head, shooting off into the woodland behind him. Henry survived the ordeal, and 20 years passed. One day, Henry was carrying out some landscaping on his property, removing several trees in the process, but one was proving difficult to uproot. Henry resolved to blow it up with some TNT, which wasn't so unusual then as it sounds now. Henry detonated the TNT and died instantly. Not from the explosion itself, though. Buried deep within that tree was the very bullet that had missed him by a millimeter 2 decades earlier. In the explosion, it had been launched back out and hit its original mark. Seems his jilted lover finally got her payback. You're about to see why you should never turn your back on a cowboy. This armed robber seems to be new to the job, as he wears no facial cover, nor does he see fit to change out of his regular, casual hoodie and cap. He threatens the till operator and the mustachioed bystander with his handgun, and things seem to be going fairly well for him. But by the way this guy takes off his glasses, you can tell it wasn't going to end well for the robber. Things take a turn for the unexpected when an oblivious customer approaches the till with their items.
The person circled there would most likely be me in this scenario, but instead, my cute hearing, I'm just going to turn around and go, nope, I'm out of here. I'm going to continue to see if I can get anything else.
Would-be robber is startled and makes a serious error. Little does he know the cowboy is waiting for him to slip up. As soon as the robber turns around, the cowboy intervenes. This rare, unlikely act of calm bravery proved to be a potentially life-saving example of right person, right place, right time. After some scuffling, the robber is apprehended by a neat throat takedown. Let's see that again. Is Karma a feminist? Looking at most of human history, you probably wouldn't think so. Yet this story from 1887 raises a few questions. In an effort to have a jolly good laugh at the expense of the female sex, a handful of fellows, who were displeased with the success of women's rights activists in their Kansas town, decided to take action. The group of around 20 men submitted their candidate for the mayoral elections, a woman named Susanna Salter. But their chortle soon turned to gasps of astonishment. The men were certain that no one would ever vote for a woman as mayor. But Susanna, who had been involved with the push to allow female involvement into politics, went on to win 60% of the vote. She became the first female mayor in the United States, and what could be described as the living manifestation of a middle finger. There's nothing more rage-inducing than a reckless driver who feels like they have the right to break the rules at their own convenience, especially when they put others in danger in the process. Luckily, from time to time, karma has our backs. Case in point, this impatient meathead decides the driving lanes aren't up to his standards and opts to speed along in the parking lane, giving the middle finger as he does. Fast forward a bit and he gets held at a set of lights. The cameraman has the great pleasure of seeing red and blue lights appear in the reflection of the car in front. Like we all would, the cameraman chuckles as he passes the reckless driver, who now has a cop car behind him and has descended into an all-encompassing rage, denying any responsibility. Karma served. In this similar case of deliciously instant karma, we see a dash cam owner pull into the left lane, which appears to be clear to avoid a buildup of traffic. Unfortunately, another vehicle is speeding way over the limit, too fast to be initially noticed by the dashcam user. The speeding car behind has to brake, much to his annoyance. So much so, he pulls up in front of the camera owner and climbs out, ready to rumble. But the moment he steps out, he realizes his error. A cop has seen the whole thing and has pulled up directly behind. Despite a hilariously feeble attempt to point the blame on the dashcam user as a justification for the recklessness and seeming threat of violence, there's no way out of this one, and he ended up with a ticket. Ever left a job interview feeling like things couldn't have gone worse? No matter how bad yours was, this next candidate takes the karma cake. When candidate recruiter Matt Buckland was rudely barged out of the way and told to go himself on the tube to work, he brushed off the aggressive encounter and went on with his day.
Thank you, BMAs, for doing that bleeping thing. I don't know how to do that, so if somebody could show me how it's done, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
He certainly didn't expect that once he reached his office and sat down to interview a potential new employee, he would find that same antagonistic commuter sat smiling politely across from him. Needless to say, that particular candidate didn't get the job. He did, however, get a healthy dose of karma. What's the worst first impression you've ever made? Let me know in the comments below. Who knows, I may even feature yours in a future video. Sports can get pretty heated from time to time, but that doesn't justify cheating. It definitely doesn't justify pushing a fellow cyclist off their bike during a race. The karma here is twofold, as the aggressive cyclist initially falls off his bike before a motley crew of outraged fans even step in. But once they do, he's hoisted up and over. There's a moment of dread before we see the water below, but either way, it's a long fall, and justice is well and truly served. Not everyone gets to administer their own form of justice in retaliation to being robbed, nor should they. We have laws to free us of that responsibility, but sometimes the heat of the moment provides an opportunity that's hard to resist. This video outside a Denny's in Los Angeles shows an attempted robbery gone wrong. When the perpetrator forces his way into his victim's car, stealing items and making a break for it, he never anticipates that this individual would seek his own justice. Before the thief knows what's what, the robbed man quickly whips his car around and floors it toward the robber. The robber tries to pull out his gun in defense, but it's too late, and he is sent barreling into the air. That's not all though. When the car collides with the thief, his gun goes off, and he shoots himself in the leg. He won't be running from any cops anytime soon, as he ended up in intensive care. When he's finally released from hospital, his on-camera crime means there won't be much to celebrate either, as he'll be straight off to the slammer. Does PETA control karma? It certainly seemed that way after this unbelievable case of pro-animal rights instant karma took place in 2015. When a Texan spotted a shelled intruder on his property, he quickly grabbed his .38 revolver. You know, because gunfire is the only rational way to get rid of an armadillo. He took aim, fired 3 times, and was struck in the head by his own bullet after it ricocheted off the critter's shell. Luckily for him, the bullet struck his jaw, and though the injuries were minor, I doubt he'll be rushing into another showdown against one of these animals anytime soon.
They're often called the armored animal.
What is it with Texans and hilarious acts of karma? The tale of Francois L'Olonnais is a funny one. He was a pirate operating in the Caribbean during the 1600s. He had a nasty habit of torturing the locals in the coastline towns he and his crew pillaged, taking particular enjoyment in cutting chunks of flesh from his unfortunate victims until they succumbed to their gruesome injuries. karma finally took its own chunk out of Lolane when he was shipwrecked and captured by natives near Panama. These unfriendly locals gave the pirate their customary treatment for unwelcome guests. They tore him into pieces, alive, throwing his body limb after limb into a raging fire. Now for the infamous case of Maximilien Robespierre. You may already be aware that, during the French Revolution, the newly invented guillotine was up and down more than a Parisian courtesan's girdle. This was due in no small part to the strong advocacy for execution from prominent individuals during and after the Revolution, for which only the highly efficient guillotine could meet the demands. One individual, Monsieur Robespierre, was particularly fond of sending his perceived political opponents to the block during the Reign of Terror. But his strong lust for clean cuts was soon turned around on him, and his own neck ended up on the chopping block when the chaotic tides of the Revolution turned against him. The same type of sharp, shiny poetic justice also fell upon the necks of many of his peers. It's easy to get a little caught up in the wildness of competitive sports, but that doesn't excuse being a jerk to the players. After all, whether your team or not, they're there for your entertainment. In one game, Steve Sullivan of the Chicago Blackhawks sustained a painful hockey stick to the face, but this hockey fan doesn't seem to care much about mutual respect as he mocks Sullivan from the other side of the barrier. Steve seems unfazed. Perhaps he knew karma was about to deal out some sweet, sweet revenge for him. Shortly afterwards, a stray puck flies through the air, over the barrier, and straight into the once mocking face of a certain deserving crowd member. As if to rub salt into the wound, Sullivan then goes on to score 2 goals in the game for the Blackhawks. Justice doesn't get much quicker or more appropriate than that. So, do you have your own instant karma stories? I'd love to read.
I'm Kento Bento. Shiratori sound asleep in his futon bed. But of course, what they didn't realize was that they were looking at something else. A pile of loose floorboards underneath his duvet designed to trick them. It wasn't until the next morning that they finally discovered the truth and the alarm was sounded. But by then, Shiratori was long gone. Now, he had escaped, but if you've watched any of our previous videos, you'll know that things aren't always as they seem. In fact, for Yoshie Shiratori, aka the prison break magician, this was only the beginning. 3 days later, he was caught trying to steal supplies from a hospital, and just like that, he was back in the slammer. But this time, for his escape attempt, he was sentenced to life in prison. He would never be with his family again, his wife and his daughter, and all the months of planning had led to just 3 days of freedom. It now seemed he'd be locked up for a very long time. 6 years later, in 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, Shiratori found himself transferred to Akita Prison in Akita City. There, the guards treated him even worse than in Aomori. They had heard about Shiratori's previous escape and were determined to make an example out of him. They wanted to make sure he would never escape again. Along with the usual beatings, he was forced to partake in extreme manual labor, made to sleep on the hard concrete floor in the severe winter cold, and placed into solitary confinement for extended periods of time. Now, this was a specially made solitary confinement cell, which was very small and had a very high ceiling, with the walls covered with copper sheets so smooth that it was impossible to grip. In addition, there was almost no sunlight even in the daytime, with the only window light coming from a small sealed skylight high above. This was a room designed to keep escape artists from escaping, and if that wasn't enough, the guards also made sure that Shiratori was handcuffed at all times. Now, despite the constant abuse, one of the guards, Kobayashi, in fact the head guard, took pity on him. Kobayashi never laid a finger, and even seemed to check up on him from time to time, concerned for his well-being. Perhaps this made life a little more bearable for Shiratori, and it might have even been what kept his will alive all the way to the night of June 15th. It was a stormy night, and Shiratori was in the middle of one of his extended stays in solitary confinement. At around midnight, one of the guards peered into his cell and couldn't believe his eyes. He opened the cell door and looked around in astonishment, as Yoshie Shiratori had vanished into thin air. All that was left was his handcuffs. So how did he do it? Well, there were a few assumptions the guards made that did not apply to Shiratori. For one, handcuffs simply didn't work on him. Shiratori was actually a master of getting out of handcuffs, and in fact had several methods to choose from. Here, he decided to go with the familiar lock-picking method, but he really could have gone with any of them. He had thoroughly scoured his surroundings to find anything that could be of use in an escape, and just like in Aomori prison, he was able to uncover a loose bit of wire. Perhaps it was from one of the items Kobayashi brought him, but this wasn't clear. After freeing himself from the cuffs, he placed his palms and soles of his feet on the smooth copper sheets and started climbing the unclimbable wall. It turned out Shiratori was also an expert climber, with an uncanny ability to scale like a lizard. Once he reached the skylight above, he noticed that, yes, the window was sealed, but the wooden framing around it was starting to rot. And so thereafter, night after night, when the guards weren't looking, he'd climb the copper walls and loosen the framing, bit by bit. Afterwards, he'd climb back down and place the handcuffs back on, as to not rouse suspicion. After a couple months, the window finally came loose, and from there, it was just about choosing the right day. He waited until a particular stormy night, so the guards wouldn't hear the footsteps on the roof. And that was it. He had escaped from prison again. Now this time, he wouldn't be caught. Or at least, not in the way you'd expect. 3 months later, on September 18th, the head guard, Kobayashi, was at home when he heard a knock on the door. To his surprise, it was the fugitive Yoshie Shiratori, unkempt and disheveled, and he needed a favor. A stunned Kobayashi took him in and fed him, all the while listening to what he had to say. Shiratori explained that he didn't actually mind being in prison, and that the only reason he escaped twice now was due to the tremendous abuse he suffered at the hands of the sadistic guards. Kobayashi, however, was the only one who treated him with any amount of respect, and so he felt he owed it to him to let him in on his grand plan. Now, this plan involved Shiratori willingly, yes, handing himself over to the Justice Department, where he could then personally make a case for how corrupt and barbaric the Japanese prison system was, and there needed to be reform. He wanted to campaign for change, and in the process gain his legal freedom through a civil lawsuit. He felt this was the only way he could realistically end up with his family. This, of course, was a super ambitious plan, and as a fugitive on the run, he was well aware of that, which is why he needed Kobayashi, the well-respected head guard of Akita prison, to vouch for him, to strengthen his credibility. As the only guard who ever treated him right, he had a feeling Kobayashi would do the right thing. Minutes later, while Shiratori was in the toilet, Kobayashi called the police. Maybe not a great plan. Just like that, Shiratori was back in prison, and this time, he vowed never to trust an officer of the law again. For the second escape, the courthouse added 3 more years to his life sentence. Now, Shiratori requested to be sent to a Tokyo prison, where the weather was warmer, as he couldn't stand the cold in the northern prisons. His previous stints had weakened him severely, but he was denied his request. Instead, the judge sentenced him to the infamous Abashiri prison in Hokkaido, the northernmost prison in Japan. No man had ever escaped from this wintry hellhole of a prison. It was now 1943, and the cold was unbearable in Abashiri, as the temperature in the cells was below freezing point. Whenever inmates received their prison food, the miso soup and soy sauce would often freeze up. In this temperature, a handcuffed Shiratori was thrown into an open cell in summer clothing, and he immediately felt the paralyzing sting of cold air. Perhaps in a fit of desperation, he tried to force himself past the guards, but they were able to push him back and beat him down. An enraged and defiant Shiratori stood back up and vowed that he would escape from Abashiri prison, like he's always done, and that there was nothing they could do about it. In fact, he claimed there was little point even putting handcuffs on him, as he'd always find a way to break free. If not by lockpicking, then, well, this. He then proceeded to rip apart the chain of his handcuffs, to the horror of the guards. It turned out Shiratori had another special ability. Aside from his outstanding climbing abilities, he also possessed incredible strength, almost superhuman strength. Back in Akita prison, he could have broken free of the cuffs the physical way if he didn't have to put them back on. Now, this was impressive, but it wasn't so smart to lay his cards on the table like that, as the guards were starting to build an escape profile on him. They knew he had lockpicking abilities, lizard-like climbing abilities, and now almost superhuman strength. And so they set out to devise the ultimate escape-proof cell, one that was sure to be Shiratori-proof. And they came up with this. The new cell had steel fixtures with a low chance of rot. Any openings, even the bars removed, were made smaller than his body, meaning there was no way he could physically fit through. He had specially made solid iron handcuffs that tied his hands behind his back, and leg cuffs that made him barely able to stand. These cuffs weighed 20 kgs each and had no keyhole, which meant they could not be lockpicked. And the only way they could be removed was by 2 metalwork specialists who would come once every few weeks to remove them in an arduous 2-hour process. It was at this point, and only this point, that he could even take a bath. And he certainly needed one, as weeks of being shackled up with no movement meant his cuff wounds were infested with maggots. On top of that, and as cold as it had already been, it wasn't even peak winter yet. Any strength he would have left would surely be nullified by the upcoming freeze. Though just in case, they still made sure to cut his already meager food portions in half. And so that was it. Even for Shiratori, this was too much. As winter came, he succumbed to his fate. Every day, the guards would slide his meal through the opening, and he'd be forced to grovel like a dog. His hand and leg cuffs made every action awkward and uncomfortable, with even sleeping being a pain. There was no doubt life in Abashiri prison was absolute torture. Now fast forward, Shiratori was somehow able to survive through the winter, and spring was coming. This meant he was starting to get his strength back. But still, what could he really do? He was literally in a bind. Months passed and, well, nothing seemed to happen. Then one night, in August, a guard in his office was doing some paperwork when he heard some shuffling on the roof. He wasn't sure what it was, but he decided to check on the prisoners. As he looked inside Shiratori's inescapable cell, he was stunned. The futon bed and prison garments were neatly folded up. The specially made 20 kg handcuffs and leg cuffs that would have required 2 specialists 2 hours to remove was placed on the side, and Shiratori was nowhere to be seen. He had finally fulfilled his promise to the guards. The alarm immediately sounded, but despite the work of the search party, it seemed he had truly disappeared. But how on earth did this happen? How did he escape from the fortress that was Abashiri prison? Well, preparation had started 6 months earlier. At the time, he didn't have the strength or stamina to mount any sort of escape, not to mention the restraints he was in. But one thing he did have was time and patience. Every day, the guards would slide his meal through, and while he struggled to eat his food off the floor, he always made sure to save a little bit of the miso soup in the corner. You see, every night, he would hobble awkwardly to the inspection window and splash a little of it on the steel frame. He would also dab some on his handcuffs and leg cuffs. Now, his intention was for the salt content of the miso soup to oxidize the screws and bolts, eventually corroding and loosening it. After a month, this technique of rusting through the iron actually worked, and the first screw came out. The next few months saw screws and bolts coming loose, assisted by the use of the first screw as a sort of screwdriver. By the end of spring, he was able to fully remove his handcuffs and leg cuffs, as well as the steel frame of the inspection window. But there was a problem. The size of the opening was smaller than his body, which meant he couldn't fit through, a contingency thought out by the guards. What they didn't account for, though, was Shiratori's fourth ability, which involved being able to dislocate his joints at will. With this, he was now able to slide through the opening like a caterpillar, this repertoire of skills thus surely making him an honorary member of the X-Men. With that, he climbed through a broken window in the roof and vanished. Impressively, Shiratori had now escaped from 3 prisons, as well as being the only man to ever escape Abashiri prison. Now, good on him for escaping, but this was northern Hokkaido, and the only direction he could have gone to was the cold, snowy mountains. Actually, the prison guards felt that they had the last laugh, because if the cold didn't get him, the mountain bears certainly would. Despite this likelihood, there was one person who stayed hopeful, and that was Shiratori's wife. But she was still worried, because even if he was alive, she knew he wouldn't be able to make it back to his family, as the authorities would be constantly on his tail. Which is why she was desperately and secretly hoping that Japan would lose the war, as that would enable the US to take over the country, meaning everyone would likely forget about her husband. Of course, she kept this to herself, but then a year later, in August 1945, she got her wish. The Americans had now taken over the country's penitentiary system, and sweeping changes were being made. And it did seem, perhaps, that the manhunt for Yoshie Shiratori had now taken a back seat. Yet the question remained, where was he? And was he even alive? The answer was yes, he was alive, and living a solitary life, this time self-imposed. It turned out he had discovered an abandoned mine on a mountainside in the Hokkaido wilderness, and was able to make a home for himself. For food, he lived off nuts and berries, wild rabbits and raccoons, and was even able to learn to catch crabs from a stream by observing the habits of bears. Life was steady and safe, but after a while, curiosity got the better of him, and so after 2 years of isolation, he made his way down the mountain to a nearby village. What he saw astounded him. The streets were filled with signs written in English. The posters and flags emblematic of the war effort had vanished. And even more strange, young Japanese girls were holding hands with American soldiers. What on earth was going on? He grabbed a newspaper that had been set aside, flipped through the pages, and it was only then that he found out about the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered the previous year, and he couldn't believe it. As with his wife, he felt it was now pointless to hide, and so bid farewell to his old hunter-gatherer lifestyle. He headed south of Abashiri for the next 50 days, until he reached the city of Sapporo. At this point, he was starving, so he found himself a nice ripe tomato from a nearby field, which was a huge mistake. A farmer had spotted him and mistook him for a well-known local thief, which led to a scuffle, resulting in the farmer's abdomen being pierced by a blade. Sadly, he bled out and died, but not before Shiratori was arrested for the crime. It wasn't long until police found out that they in fact had the infamous Yoshie Shiratori in their custody. For his multiple escapes and having now murdered the farmer, despite his claims of self-defense, he was sentenced to death by the district court of Sapporo. And in 1947, he was sent to Sapporo prison to await execution. Now, to ensure he wouldn't escape this time while on death row, he was placed under 24-hour surveillance, with 6 armed guards personally assigned to his watch. As for the cell itself, it was upgraded further from the one in Abashiri prison, with reinforced doors, ceilings, bars, windows. In fact, any openings were made smaller than the size of his head, not just his body, learning from the Abashiri escape, as while he may be able to dislocate his joints, he certainly can't dislocate his skull. As long as his head can't fit, they were good. The 6 guards were so confident, in fact, that they didn't even bother cuffing him. Now, Shiratori was getting old, and the odds of escaping by this point were looking slim. As his execution loomed near, there was little he could really do, and the guards knew that. They could see the desperation on his face, looking up, searching for an escape plan that they knew would never come. Though still, just in case, they made sure to search his room every night while he was taking a bath in the bathhouse, inspecting the ceiling, skylight, and any other openings. A month passed, and winter was now coming, weakening him further, and the realization was starting to dawn on him. He grew increasingly despondent, staying in bed, refusing to wake up, despite the orders of the guards. This went on for a while, until one morning, the guards had enough and entered the cell to discipline him. They flipped over the duvet, and he was gone. This was not possible. How did he do it this time? Going back to when he was first placed under 24-hour surveillance with the 6 armed guards personally assigned to his watch, he had in fact conditioned them to look up and keep up from the very start. Not just because his previous escape attempts involved climbing through skylight windows on ceilings, but also his suspicious yet, as it turned out, very intentional behavior of constantly looking up to figure out an escape plan. Little did they know, it was all an act, and that he already had one, but it would be taking place precisely where they weren't looking. You see, it turned out the authorities were so concerned with him escaping through a window or skylight that they neglected to reinforce the bottom. This ironically ended up being his easiest and simplest escape, because all he had to do was remove the bolted floorboards, which wasn't easy but he had experience, and using random cutlery and a miso soup bowl, dig his way to freedom. This took over a month, and he was able to hide his activities due to A, the guards not suspecting this approach, and B, the floorboard panels being put back in place every night after digging. The 6 guards thought they were keeping a good eye on him even at night, but with the hole consistently positioned underneath the futon and duvet, and it increasingly becoming the norm to refuse the orders of the guards to wake up, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Placing a pile of loose floorboards underneath the duvet to trick them was also a callback to his first prison escape in Aomori. So he had now escaped from prison 4 times, and by this point, the story is starting to get ridiculous. But this perpetual cycle of capture and escape was about to end, because a year later, in 1948, Shiratori was exhausted. He was in his 40s now, and this was a young man's game. One day, in the Kotoni neighborhood, still in Sapporo, as he stopped to rest, a policeman just happened to sit by his side for a smoke. He didn't know who Shiratori was, but he struck up a conversation with him. Shiratori, of course, was wary of his presence and tried to play it cool, all the while attempting to figure out a way to remove himself from the situation without being suspicious. Suddenly, the policeman did something unexpected, at least to him. He pulled out another cigarette and offered it to him. Shiratori was stunned. You see, cigarettes were expensive luxury items in Japan at the time, and the fact that someone offered it to him just out of the kindness of his heart brought tears to his eyes. Not to mention, all his life he had been abused and mistreated by officers of the law, with even the head guard Kobayashi turning his back on him. And here was an instance of an officer treating him kindly, with respect, and with no prejudgment. As he smoked the cigarette, Shiratori couldn't help but tell the officer his full name, Yoshie Shiratori, and that he had escaped from Sapporo prison last year. In fact, he had escaped from prison 4 times in his life. It was strangely a relief to get it all off his chest, and he was even ready for the consequences. After the Kobayashi incident, he had vowed never to trust another officer of the law again. But the simple act of receiving a cigarette from a stranger broke him. Of course, he was arrested again, but this time, things were different. Maybe it was the fact that he willingly gave himself up, or that Japan's justice system was going through a change. But the High Court of Sapporo became sympathetic to Shiratori's plight, and some of his past claims were recognized, such as acknowledging the farmer's death as a legitimate case of self-defense. They also made note that throughout all 4 of his prison escapes, he didn't kill or injure a single guard, despite the abuse he may have suffered at their hands. At the end of the deliberation, the High Court dismissed the murder charge, revoking his death sentence, and instead sentenced him to just 20 years in prison. Further, they approved his request to be transferred to a Tokyo prison, where the weather was warmer. He was getting what he wanted. In Tokyo, he was sent to Fuchu prison, where, for the first time, the guards actually treated him well. It was a weird feeling. There were all these precautions and security measures in place to ensure that the infamous prison break magician wouldn't escape. But the truth was, Shiratori didn't really care anymore. Everything he'd been fighting against, the mistreatment from guards, the death penalty, even the northern climate, was no longer of concern. And he was at peace. There was no need to escape anymore. He finally accepted his punishment, and for the remainder of his sentence, acted as a model prisoner. Just 14 years later, in 1961, he was released on parole, and for the first time in a long time, he was truly a free man. He decided to head back to Aomori, where it all began, and meet up with his daughter, who, by this point, unfortunately, was the only family member he had left. For his incredible escapes, Yoshie Shiratori became a legend, an anti-hero in Japan. But it was very much the opposite for the country's penitentiary system, which had somehow allowed him to escape time and time again. This was a national embarrassment for Japan. But just as preventing criminals from breaking out of the system is vital for the safety of society, so is preventing them from breaking into the system. Your system, that is. And for that, I'd personally recommend Dashlane.
That's all for today's video. I'm surprised that was a long video. Wasn't expecting that, but anyway, that's all for today's video. If you're at all new to my channel, hit that like button down below and smash that subscribe button. Hit that little bell icon down below to become a part of the Drunken Squad. And a new line of merch is coming out soon, so be sure. This is the last-ditch effort of me having a merchandise line until I get a larger channel. So, and the 5 coin event is still going on. So, this is your last opportunity to get one of the 5 coins and to be shout out and if at all, physically present in one of my videos. So, be cool, stay safe, and stay on the law. Well, not on the law, but with the law. That's all for today's video. Goodbye!